The afternoon light hit the 42nd floor window at an exact 30-degree angle, cutting a sharp, blinding gold line across the polished mahogany desk and catching the edge of the resume in the woman's hand across from me. I had prepared for a ruthless final interview. I hadn't prepared for the woman herself to make the room feel wrong before a single question was asked. The corporate office was perfectly silent, save for the faint engineered hum of the climate control systems working to keep the glass tower at a steady 68 degrees. I sat in the heavy leather guest chair, my portfolio resting flat across my knees, waiting for the standard barrage of technical questions. The external recruiter had been explicitly clear during the prep call. The vice president of operations conducted the final round for all senior data architecture roles herself. She was notoriously ruthless, holding a reputation for dismantling unprepared contractors within the first 5 minutes of an interview. The silence should have been the intimidating part. It wasn't. She wore a structured white suit, the tailoring precise, her blonde hair falling in loose, deliberate waves over her shoulders. She was resting her chin heavily on her hand, a slight, almost amused smile altering the professional, severe geometry of her face. She held my printed resume loosely between 2 fingers, not reading a single word of the text. I shifted my weight in the leather chair, the material creaking softly beneath me, and turned my head slightly to look back over my shoulder. I half expected to find someone else standing behind me, some other executive she was actually addressing. The frosted glass doorway was completely empty. I looked back at her. The harsh afternoon light caught the faint faded line of a scar just below her lower lip, pulling the corner of her mouth into a slightly one-sided smile. 17 years. You grew into the shoulders, Claire said. Her voice had dropped the higher, breathless cadence of her youth, replaced by the resonant, measured tone of someone used to dictating the flow of millions of dollars. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop. I kept my hands flat and perfectly still on my leather portfolio. My throat felt like dry archival paper. You're the VP of operations. I am, she said, setting the paper down on the mahogany surface. And you're a senior predictive modeler looking to overhaul my division's data infrastructure. She leaned back, the leather of her executive chair groaning softly in the quiet room. That should have been my warning. When I saw the name on the shortlist yesterday morning, I thought it was a statistical anomaly. A different Ethan Carter. There are at least 400 in the tri-state area alone. I didn't smile. I studied the margins of her desk, cataloging the pristine alignment of her monitor, the precise stack of quarterly reports, looking for the angle she was playing. I hadn't seen Claire Bennett since I was 12 years old, and she was a college freshman living next door. She was the girl who used to patch up my scraped knees on the concrete driveway and sit on the porch swing, listening to me explain rudimentary coding logic when the rest of the neighborhood found me insufferable. Now, she was an executive in a glass tower overlooking the city, and I was the independent contractor brought in to fix a bleeding data system. Why did you keep me on the interview list? I asked, keeping my voice level, stripped of any familiar inflection. Her one-sided smile faded into something entirely structural, weary, and heavily guarded. Because your proficiency scores in predictive analytics were the highest this firm has seen in 3 years. You rebuilt the logistics grid for a national freight company last winter and shaved 12% off their latency. And because I have a very specific, very quiet problem that requires someone who doesn't panic. Before I could answer, the heavy glass door clicked open, the magnetic lock disengaging with a sharp snap. A man walked in holding a digital tablet. He wore a navy suit that looked expensive, but fit poorly across the shoulders. Claire, the compliance logs from Q2 are still showing the variance, he said, not looking up from the screen. He paused, stepping fully into the room, finally noticing me sitting in the guest chair. I didn't realize you were in a final round. Marcus, Claire said, her voice dropping to a cool, flat register that instantly built a wall of ice around her desk. This is Ethan Carter. He's taking the senior architect contract. Marcus raised an eyebrow. He was the internal compliance auditor. The leverage in the room immediately shifted toward him. It was written in the way he stood, His weight settled casually, knowing he had the institutional high ground. Is he? HR hasn't cleared the final background metrics. He looked at me, his eyes tracking my lack of a tie, the practical scuffs on my heavy leather boots, the rolled-up sleeves of my button-down shirt. We have a strict workplace policy regarding vendor relations and data access. Claire, especially given the current rumors circulating about the Q2 data leak. Mr. Carter's metrics are perfect, Claire said. She didn't look at him. She looked at her monitor. He starts tomorrow. Marcus tapped a heavy finger against his tablet. I'll be monitoring his access logs personally. We can't afford any more anomalies in this department. He turned and walked out, letting the door swing shut on its hydraulic hinges. It sealed with a heavy, final click. I looked at Claire. The confident executive posture had slipped, just a fraction of an inch. Her hands were folded on the desk, but her left thumbnail was digging sharply into the side of her right index finger, a microtel I remembered vividly from when she used to study for her undergraduate finals on that old wooden porch. A Q2 data leak, I said, my voice quiet, observing the tension radiating from her shoulders. Someone in my division authorized a data transfer that violated our enterprise security policy, she said, her hands remaining tightly folded. It's a fireable offense. It strips my equity entirely. Marcus is leading the internal audit. He thinks I did it to cover a quarterly loss projection. I didn't. But the server logs are a mess, deliberately scrambled, and I have exactly 8 weeks before the board demands a full, unredacted report. Marcus's compliance group signed off on keeping the legacy basement server in service last quarter. If the vulnerability originated there, his department would be answering questions too. You need me to reconstruct the server architecture and trace the digital chain of custody, I said, before Marcus uses the missing data to force you out of the firm. Yes. She looked at the window, the afternoon light casting long, unforgiving shadows across her face. You don't have to take it, Ethan. It's a mess. If he catches you digging where you shouldn't, he'll blacklist you across the industry. My old mentor in the university data science lab used to say the same thing before handing me an impossible algorithmic reconstruction. The strongest position is the one you never have to raise your voice to defend. I opened my portfolio, uncapped my heavy brass pen, and signed the non-disclosure agreement on top of my stack of intake papers. The ink flowed dark and permanent. I slid the document across the polished mahogany desk until it rested inches from her hand. I'll need read-only access to the central repository by 8 a.m., I said. The primary server room was located on the 39th floor, a windowless stretch of heavy cooling fans, raised anti-static flooring, and blinking, monolithic racks of data storage. The air was perpetually dry and freezing. I spent the first 3 days completely isolated, mapping the database schema line by line. It was a tangled ruin of conflicting permissions, redundant queries, and fragmented code that looked like someone had taken a sledgehammer to the architecture. Claire came down on the 4th evening. The main office above had long since cleared out, leaving only the skeleton crew of overnight security. I was sitting at a battered folding table I had repurposed as a workstation, 3 monitors glowing fiercely with lines of Python script in the dim room. She stood in the doorway, the heavy security door propped open with a rubber wedge. She was watching me type. You haven't left the building since Tuesday, she said. The data doesn't sleep, I replied, not looking away from the scrolling terminal. If I drop the thread on this sorting algorithm, I lose the pattern. She walked in and sat in the spare, uncomfortable metal chair next to my table. She looked exhausted, the kind of deep structural fatigue that coffee couldn't fix. The sharp white suit from Monday had been replaced by a navy blazer and gray slacks, her blonde hair pulled back into a severe, utilitarian clip. Marcus filed a formal notice of investigation with HR today, she said quietly, her voice barely carrying over the roar of the server fans. He named me as the primary subject. The enterprise policy states that if I can't provide the origin of the anomalous data transfer by the end of the month, I have to take administrative leave. It's the first step to termination. I hit the return key. letting the heavy query run. I turned my chair to look at her. She was 36 years old now, a high-powered executive with a corner office, but in the sterile, unsparing light of the server room, she just looked worn down by the gravity of the accusations. "I found the initial access note," I said. She blinked, straightening in the metal chair, the fatigue vanishing for a split second. "What?" "The data transfer wasn't executed from your terminal. It was spoofed." I pointed to the second monitor, highlighting a block of green text. "Someone used a legacy macro. It masked the IP address, bouncing the request through the old, deprecated server in the basement before pinging the main repository. It's old code. Sloppy. Can you prove who wrote it?" "Not yet, but I have the digital timestamps. I just need to cross-reference them with the physical badge swipe logs for the basement sector." She let out a long, ragged breath, her shoulders dropping. For a second, the executive armor completely vanished. She was just Claire. "You were 12, she said, her voice tight, a sudden vulnerability cracking through her composure. "You used to sit on my steps and build circuits out of copper wire and stolen batteries. Now you're saving my career against a corporate shark." I kept my hands resting on the edge of the keyboard. I didn't lean in. I didn't try to close the space between us. "You listened to me when no one else in that neighborhood did?" She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting the silver ring on her right hand. "I'm the VP of Operations. I'm nearly 40. Ethan, I shouldn't be in a position where I have to rely on a contractor to save my neck. It makes me look incompetent." Her voice carried the sharp, brittle edge of insecurity, the fear that the power dynamic had completely inverted, leaving her exposed and dependent on the kid she used to look out for. "You aren't relying on a contractor," I said, my voice perfectly level, stripping away the emotion and leaving only the facts. "You hired the best predictive modeler in the city to do exactly what he is paid to do. You identified a critical failure point and deployed the correct asset to neutralize it. That is the definition of operational competence." I reached over to the small coffee station I'd set up on the rolling supply cart earlier that afternoon. I poured a cup of black coffee from the thermos, dropped a single ice cube into it to strip the boiling heat, and set the paper cup on the table next to her hand. I knew she hated waiting for coffee to cool. She used to burn her tongue on the porch trying to drink it too fast. I didn't announce the gesture. I just went back to typing. She stared at the paper cup, watching the ice cube melt rapidly into the dark liquid. Her thumbnail stopped pressing into her finger. "Thank you," she said, picking up the cup. By week 3, the sheer volume of the data reconstruction required us to sit side by side. The enterprise security policy explicitly dictated that a senior executive had to physically authorize the decryption of legacy archives on a rolling hourly basis. We spent Thursday night locked in her office. The afternoon light had long since vanished, replaced by the amber grid-like glow of the city skyline shining through the glass. We had 50 pages of printed hexadecimal logs spread across her mahogany desk, a sprawling map of numbers and letters that held the key to the sabotage. "Read the next string," I said, a yellow highlighter uncapped and ready in my hand. 04FA, Claire read, her finger tracing the dense line of text on the paper. "Timestamp 2214 month." I scanned the master list on my dual monitors. Matches? Okay, next line. 19 BC, timestamp 221403. We worked in a quiet, relentless rhythm. The shared task formed a mechanical, undeniable bond in the room. There was no small talk, no filler conversations about the weather or the weekend, just the sound of rustling paper, the rapid click of my mechanical keyboard, and the steady, grounding cadence of her voice reading out the corrupted data strings. It was precision work, demanding absolute focus. At 11:30 p.m., she sighed heavily and dropped her pen onto the desk. It clattered loudly in the quiet room. My eyes are crossing. The numbers are physically vibrating off the page. "We have enough for tonight," I said. I saved the decryption script and locked the terminal with a multi-factor passcode. I started gathering the loose papers, squaring the edges into neat, perfectly aligned stacks. Claire watched me from her chair. You don't have to stay and organize my desk. The cleaning crew doesn't come in until tomorrow. I kept sorting the papers, sliding them into numbered folders. I'm not leaving sensitive system logs spread out for anyone to find. Security is 90% physical. She didn't get up. She leaned her elbow on the heavy leather armrest, resting her chin in her hand, watching my hands move across the desk. I remember when you promised you'd fix my broken CD player. I was a sophomore. You sat on the porch until 2 in the morning with a soldering iron because you said you wouldn't leave until the disc spun. I placed the stacked papers into the secure lower drawer of her desk and pushed it shut. Listening for the heavy mechanical click of the locking mechanism, I kept the promise. You did, she said softly. I sat down in the leather guest chair across from her. I didn't have an itinerary. The data was secure. The script was running. I could have packed my bag and gone back to my empty apartment, but I stayed. We sat in the quiet office, the amber light of the city painting the walls in long, rectangular shadows. It wasn't awkward. It was just a shared silence, a temporary shelter from the corporate machinery grinding outside the door. I noticed a small, cracked porcelain coaster sitting on the far edge of her credenza. It was painted with a faded blue bird, the ceramic edges chipped and worn smooth. It was the exact same coaster she used to keep on her porch railing 17 years ago, the one that held her iced tea while I worked on my circuits. An ordinary, worthless object that carried the weight of a decade and a half of memory. I didn't point it out. I didn't ask why she kept it. I just cataloged it, the data point quietly settling into my understanding of her. By the 8th week, the corporate atmosphere finally shifted on a Tuesday. I was in the 39th floor break room, pouring a fresh coffee, when I heard the low murmur of voices echoing from the hallway. 2 junior operations analysts were standing by the microwaves, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Marcus pulled the HR vendor file, one of them said, tapping his phone. The new data guy, Carter. He and Bennett grew up in the exact same neighborhood in the suburbs. She hired him as a favor. So she leaks the Q2 data to cover a bad operational call, then hires a childhood friend as a contractor to scrub the server and hide the tracks. The second analyst shook his head, looking disgusted. Marcus is taking it to the executive board tomorrow morning. She's completely done. I set my paper cup down on the counter. I didn't throw it away. I walked out of the break room, bypassed the elevators, and took the concrete stairs up to the 42nd floor, taking them 2 at a time. Claire was standing by the window in her office. The afternoon light was hitting the glass at that exact 30-degree angle, but today it offered no warmth, only a glaring, sterile illumination. She looked fragile, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, holding herself together by sheer willpower. They leaked it, she said as I closed the door behind me. She didn't turn around to look at me. Marcus sent a blind copy email to the department heads 10 minutes ago. He noted our prior residential association. He's framing it as a massive conflict of interest. He's claiming the entire audit is compromised because I brought in a ringer to cover my tracks. I stood by the edge of the desk, keeping my posture relaxed but grounded. It's a rumor. It has no structural integrity in a data-driven environment. It's enough, she said, her voice cracking slightly, the sound sharp and painful in the quiet room. She finally turned to face me. The board doesn't need mathematical proof to place me on leave, Ethan. They just need the appearance of liability. If you stay on this project, Marcus will torch your professional credibility along with mine. He'll ensure you never get another enterprise contract in this city. I kept my hands at my sides. I'm not leaving. Ethan, you have to. She walked toward me, stopping exactly 2 feet away. The sudden proximity forced me to look down slightly to meet her eyes. She looked terrified, not for herself, but for me. I'm not letting you ruin your career because you feel some residual, misplaced loyalty to a girl who gave you lemonade when you were a kid. My loyalty is to the data, I said, my voice low and exact. The data says you are innocent. The data says someone deliberately spoofed your executive credentials to bypass the firewall. Marcus doesn't care about the data, she snapped, her hands dropping to her sides. "He cares about the narrative. And the narrative right now is that we are colluding. He will care about the data." I didn't step closer. I didn't reach out to touch her arm, even though the instinct to comfort her was a heavy, physical pressure expanding in my chest. The strongest position is the one you never have to raise your voice to defend. I let the silence hold the boundary between us. I wouldn't cross the line while she was in a panic. I would secure the perimeter first. "Claire," I said. It was the first time I had used her first name aloud since the initial interview. The sound of it in the quiet, tense room carried a sudden, heavy weight, grounding the escalating panic. "I have the physical badge swipe logs from the basement. I just need 12 more hours to compile the comparative matrix and lock the timestamp correlations. Do you want me to present the technical evidence tomorrow, or do you want to lead and have me answer only what the board asks?" She stared at me, her breathing shallow, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She was waiting for me to back down, to fold under the pressure of the corporate hierarchy like everyone else did when Marcus applied leverage. I didn't move, I didn't blink. She closed her eyes, letting out a long, trembling breath. The tension slowly drained from her shoulders. 12 hours. Present the technical evidence beside me. Ethan, not in front of me. The formal executive review was held in the glass-walled boardroom on the 50th floor. The room was designed to intimidate, featuring a massive, unvarnished oak table and panoramic views of the city that made the people inside feel untouchable. Marcus sat at the head of the long table, his digital tablet glowing under the recessed lighting. 2 senior HR directors and the chief financial officer flanked him, forming a tribunal of corporate authority. Claire sat at the opposite end, her posture perfectly rigid, her hands folded calmly over a black leather folio. She wore the sharp white suit again. It was her armor. I walked into the boardroom at exactly 9 a.m. I didn't bring a laptop. I didn't wear a jacket. I carried a single, unmarked manila folder. I sat in the empty chair to Claire's right, placing the folder precisely in the center of my designated space. "Mr. Carter," Marcus said, his tone dripping with bureaucratic satisfaction. He looked at me like I was a spill on the floor. "This is an internal executive review. External contractors are not permitted to attend disciplinary hearings. I am the lead data scientist on the Q2 reconstruction," I said, my voice carrying the flat, unbothered cadence of a man reading a weather report. "My scope is correlation and timestamp reconstruction. Source system authentication is handled by the external security vendor. According to Enterprise Policy Section 4B, Subsection 3, the investigating engineer must be physically present when presenting technical evidence to the board." The CFO adjusted his glasses and nodded slowly. "The policy is clear. Proceed." Marcus frowned, his heavy fingers tapping the glass of his tablet in irritation. "Very well, the evidence is straightforward. Vice President Bennett's executive credentials were used to authorize a massive transfer of sensitive Q2 operational data to an unsecured external server on May 14th at precisely 10:14 p.m. Given the recent discovery that Mr. Carter is a personal, long-term acquaintance of Ms. Bennett, we have concluded that his internal audit is fundamentally compromised by a severe conflict of interest. We cannot trust any findings he presents." Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, offering a trap question designed to make me defensive. "Tell me, Mr. Carter, can you mathematically prove that you didn't manipulate the log files over the past 8 weeks to protect your childhood friend?" "I didn't defend my character. I didn't raise my voice to argue my integrity. I opened the manila folder. I don't need to mathematically prove my character to you, Marcus. I just need to prove the physical limitations of time and space." I slid a printed, heavily watermarked spreadsheet across the polished wood toward the CFO. Ms. Bennett's credentials were used at 22:14 card on May 14th. "We know that," Marcus snapped, rolling his eyes. "That's the basis of the entire investigation. The credentials were authenticated from Terminal 402, located in the basement legacy server room." I continued smoothly, sliding a second document forward. this one stamped with the logo of the building's external security firm. Here is the physical badge swipe log for the basement security door on the night of May 14th. Ms. Bennett's badge was not used. In fact, her badge was logged exiting the parking garage at 6:30 p.m. The CFO leaned forward, pulling the paper closer and reading the printout. Someone else swiped into the basement. Yes, I said. Badge ID 8849. Swiped in at 22:11 FRA, swiped out at 22:18 TDO, a 7-minute window, exactly enough time to execute the macro, bounce the IP, and spoof the credentials. I looked directly at Marcus, holding his gaze with dead absolute certainty. That badge belongs to Marcus Vance, head compliance auditor. The boardroom went dead silent. The hum of the air conditioning suddenly felt deafening. Marcus's face flushed a dark, mottled red, the color creeping up his neck. He slammed his hand flat on the table. That is fabricated data. He altered the physical logs to frame me. The badge logs are stored on an air-gapped security server handled by a third-party vendor off-site, I said calmly, my hands remaining flat on the table. Yesterday, the CFO sent written authorization. The vendor exported a signed, hashed, read-only report and delivered the chain of custody copy this morning, so no one in this building, including me, could alter the source record. The same export includes the authentication record for Terminal 402. The managed device token assigned to Marcus's corporate tablet authenticated there at 22:12:07, 2 minutes before the transfer, on the legacy server his own compliance group had approved. The CFO looked at Marcus. The silence in the room wasn't just quiet, it was terminal. The air had been sucked out of Marcus's lungs. Marcus, the CFO said, his voice sounding like cracking ice over a frozen lake. Hand over your tablet and your corporate badge. Your system access is suspended effective immediately. HR will escort you while legal preserves your devices and the outside forensic team verifies the chain. Marcus stared at the paper, his jaw working silently, but the chain was tight enough to strip his leverage in the room. It was a mathematical cage, and the door had just locked. He had no leverage left. He stood up, the heavy chair scraping loudly against the polished floor, dropped his badge on the oak table, and walked out of the room, flanked immediately by the 2 HR directors. The CFO looked down the length of the table at Claire. She hadn't moved. She hadn't gloated. Ms. Bennett, the CFO said, his tone softening considerably. The board apologizes for this systemic failure. The access records clear your credentials from the transfer, effective immediately. Marcus's conduct will be referred to outside forensics and legal, and we will be reviewing his files to assess the full damage. Claire nodded once, a single, sharp motion. I'll expect the formal retraction sent to all department heads by noon, and my operational budget for Q3 will need to be adjusted to accommodate a full system overhaul. Of course, the CFO said. We walked back down to her 42nd floor office in complete silence. We stepped inside, and the heavy glass door clicked shut, sealing us off from the rest of the floor. The adrenaline of the boardroom faded instantly, leaving a heavy, ringing stillness in its wake. Claire walked over to the window. The afternoon light was just beginning to shift, catching the edge of the mahogany desk, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She stood with her back to me for a long time. Then, she turned around. The executive armor was completely gone. She wasn't the VP of operations right now. She looked at me, her eyes tracing the lines of my face, reading the data of who I had become over the last 17 years. You didn't just clear my name, she said, her voice quiet, almost reverent. You mathematically dismantled him. You locked every door in that room before he even knew he was trapped. He relied on a sloppy macro, I said, leaning casually against the doorframe. He didn't respect the data. He assumed he could control the narrative without covering his physical tracks. She let out a short, breathy laugh, the tension finally breaking. She walked slowly toward her desk, resting her hand on the edge, her fingers brushing lightly against the cracked porcelain bird coaster. She looked down at it, her thumb tracing the chipped edge, then looked back up at me. When you were 12, Claire said, the one-sided smile returning, soft and real and completely unguarded. You used to sit on my porch, drink all my lemonade, and tell my mother with absolute certainty that you were going to marry me. My chest tightened, a sudden, massive physical pressure seizing my lungs. I didn't look away. I held my ground, meeting her gaze. I remember. She leaned her chin on her hand, her eyes locking onto mine, mirroring the exact posture she had taken during the interview weeks ago. But this time, there was no corporate distance, no artificial gap in age or status, just the reality of the room, the undeniable proof of the work we had done, and the absolute safety of the silence between us. As a kid, you called me your future wife, she asked, her voice dropping to a near whisper that carried across the quiet room. Still mean it? I took one step forward, closing the distance between the door and the desk. I didn't need to give her a speech about longing, or time, or the years I spent comparing everyone else to a ghost on a porch. I just looked at her, the woman who had always been the only variable that mattered in my meticulously ordered world. I never process invalid data, Claire, I said quietly, stopping inches from her. It was always you. 6 months later, the annual corporate retreat was held on the sprawling rooftop terrace of a downtown hotel. The autumn wind was biting at the edges of the heavy gas heat lamps, swirling the smoke into the dark sky. I stood by the frosted glass railing, watching the traffic patterns on the streets below, holding 2 cups of black coffee, one with a single, rapidly melting ice cube. Claire walked out of the crowded mingling area, wearing a heavy wool coat layered over her evening dress. She looked completely relaxed, her shoulders dropped, the ambient stress of the VP title left somewhere down in the lobby. She stepped up beside me and took the cooled coffee from my hand without needing to ask, our fingers brushing lightly in the cold air. The CFO approached us a moment later, holding a glass of red wine, his face flushed from the cold. Claire, excellent quarter. The board is thrilled with the new efficiency metrics. He turned to me. And Mr. Carter, the new server architecture is flawless. No unauthorized pings in 6 months. The CFO looked between us, noting the complete lack of physical distance, the subtle way my shoulder naturally angled to block the sharp wind from hitting her. I don't believe I've formally asked, are you two still contracting on the new database build? Claire took a slow sip of her coffee. She didn't step away to create professional space. Instead, she shifted her weight, leaning her shoulder lightly, undeniably, against my arm, a concrete public choice broadcast to the man who signed her checks. Ethan isn't a contractor anymore. David, Claire said, her voice steady, warm, and utterly certain. She looked up at me, the reflection of the city lights catching brightly in her eyes, looking exactly like the afternoon sun hitting a 42nd floor window. He's my partner. I didn't raise my voice to confirm it. I didn't need to. The data was verified, the perimeter was secure, and the outcome was absolute. Integrity isn't just about telling the truth when it's convenient. It's the quiet, consistent discipline of aligning your actions with your promises, especially when the world demands you compromise. Healthy love is built on that exact same foundation. It's not found in chaotic passion or desperate speeches, but in the steady, irrefutable proof of showing up and doing the work, day after day, until the foundation is unbreakable. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this. Tell us in the comments, when did you realize that consistency was more important than grand gestures?